Okay, we're in chapter 12, our final chapter, and this is the chapter I like to call the defensiveness chapter because really this chapter is focused on some of the issues that we face as psych majors. You guys may have already encountered some of these questions where your friends ask, well, oh, you're a psych major? Are you analyzing me? Or, these kinds of things. It's like people have this misconception about what it means to be a psychologist or a psychology major. And so I just wanted to talk about a few things related to those issues. The first one is tied in nicely with the weekly exercise 11 that you guys probably have already done by now, paranormal psychology. Because psychologists are really interested in whether things like extrasensory perception, ESP, exists, we oftentimes get sort of lumped in with paranormal psychologists so that people assume that we believe the stuff that we're studying. ESP is extrasensory perception. The idea is, can you perceive with your brain or your mind things that enter your mind without having to pass first through your senses? Psychologists are really interested in that question. What if we can collect information without having to use our sense organs? That would be really interesting information, wouldn't it? Something else that psychologists have studied is past life regression therapy. There's a link here to a regression therapist's website that's pretty interesting to look at. Past life regression therapy suggests that we can hypnotize you and take you back to a previous life, or maybe you have to go through a rebirth in order to have a satisfying birth, and then you'll be able to overcome your anxiety disorders or depression or something. Psychologists study this kind of paranormal stuff to find out if there's any validity to any aspect of anything that the people are claiming. Hypnotherapy, another great example of something that psychologists study. If we hypnotize a person, will it give them access to memories that they couldn't otherwise recall? Could an eyewitness be hypnotized and generate more details from the crime than they could when they were fully conscious, right? These are the kinds of questions. Can we help you to overcome any kind of psychological disorder symptoms through hypnotherapy? These are really valid questions. People make these claims. Psychologists need to test the validity of the claims. Unfortunately, by testing these things, we enter into a catch-22. By studying parapsychological issues, the benefit is our studies may provide support for things that we now know actually do work. That would be interesting. We would like to know that. Our studies more likely are going to provide evidence that refute the claims, so that maybe people could stop wasting their money, trying to pursue these kinds of treatments, things like that. So there's that benefit. We could get support, or we would be able to refute. But the downside is, the catch-22 is, as we're studying these things to try and find out if they're true or false, it's almost like we're being lumped together with paranormal psychologists. It's like we're giving paranormal psychology credibility because we're studying it. And so it's kind of that catch-22. We don't want to give credibility to something that we're ultimately going to refute, right? If we do ultimately find evidence that shows us that past life regression doesn't really do anything, or there really is no such thing as that, after the fact, when we tell people, yeah, we've studied it, and it doesn't really work, the fact that we studied it is still looming in their minds, and they think, oh, it's kind of valid, it's kind of meaningful. Something else I wanted to point out is that every year there's a particular senator who looks at different research that was funded by the National Institutes of Health or the National Institutes of Mental Health, and different national sources of research funding, and he always calls his report the outrageous research report, on things that, can you believe we wasted our money? Our taxpayer dollars went to study why men don't like to use condoms, or whether the Asian tradition of dragon boat racing enhances the lives of cancer survivors more than walking does, or the relationship between HIV and sex in St. Petersburg, Russia, not even an American study, these kinds of things. And he says things like, we're all for medical research, but come on, spending $73,000 to study the impact of dragon boat racing on cancer survivors. I'm not sure how that gets us to the cure. So every year he does this, and every year he finds those studies that just sound crazy, and then use them as the poster children for why we really shouldn't be funding research at the rate that we do. Now, I have to say, psychologists don't usually get research grants of this sort at all. The topics that do get these kinds of larger grants are oftentimes like neuroscience and things that require MRIs and tissue cultures and animal samples where we're going to study their brains, and there are certain subjects in psychology where there are grants available, but the vast majority of psychological topics don't even get grants. Certainly not federal grants, and definitely not giant ones like that. One of my friends just recently got a grant to do research on using mobile apps, like on your mobile phone or whatever, to help remind people when they have a doctor's appointment or to take their insulin or other kinds of things. She got a grant to study that. Brace yourself for this enormous amount of money that she got. She got $1,000 to study this, and that she was using it to sort of reimburse or to reward people who were willing to talk to her about whether they use apps and other kinds of things. So $10 gift card per participant, and she had 100 participants, I think. So she had $1,000 grant. Woo, yee! That's the kind of money we usually get in psychology. So it's it's easy to make fun of this stuff, and it does sound like a lot of money to study why men don't like to use condoms, especially when you hear the statement, you go, well, I could tell you why men don't like to wear condoms. But of course, any study, when distilled down to a one-sentence description, can sound pretty stupid. I was thinking about my dissertation research that if I have to say it in one sentence, it sounds so pointless. Really what I was studying was whether people remember material better if they try to remember it or if they don't know that there's going to be a test. And that sounds so stupid because you probably think you can tell me what the answer is, which is, of course, they're going to remember it better if they try to remember it, right? Of course, the interesting thing, and this may be true for this outrageous research list too, the interesting thing in my study was people actually remembered it better when they didn't know that there was going to be a test. So sometimes outrageous research is not that outrageous. Sometimes we find out interesting things that you wouldn't otherwise know. And so, like I said, this is the defensiveness chapter. A lot of times psychology, people assume that they could have told you that that's how the data would come out. Now that they know how the data came out, they display the hindsight bias and they say, I could have told you that, when in fact they couldn't have predicted it. All right, here's another interesting one. Sci-fi money. I got this out of my favorite magazine, right? Discover magazine. Now the title of this little page from Discover magazine was called Sci-Fi Money. Grants fund research from extraterrestrial power to immortality. And what you see is that you've got two dimensions. You've got the plausible to implausible dimension of the topics, and then it's got the helps you, helps the world dimension. All right, so we've got different quadrants. Up in the plausible and helps you side, we have something that sounds pretty reasonable. The purpose is to investigate how interacting with infants alters unrelated adults' behavior. And they got $50,000 to study this via the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love, which I think doesn't sound like the National Institutes of Mental Health, does it? Look at some other topics that are in the same quadrant. How do infants affect the brain chemistry of unrelated adults? Okay, that's the one that got the pop out. We've got does belief in an afterlife predict work behavior? How do brain chemicals like oxytocin and testosterone affect our financial decisions? Do positive memories help Holocaust survivors stay alive? What is prayer and how do we engage in it? So these all fall in the plausible research that helps individuals. Over here in the Implausible research that helps individuals. We have, as lifespan increases, some biologists believe we will someday be able to solve problems of aging and achieve biological immortality. Is that desirable? Does the meaning of life depend on whether life is finite? They got $5 million to study this question. Does going to church help the mentally ill? Is there a purpose to the universe? Does faith healing work? So these are on the hard to pin down, so they're calling it implausible, but it would help individuals. How about this one? This is in the plausible, and it helps the world. Data collection of DNA from 4,000 individuals with extremely high IQs, and what they're trying to figure out is the genetics of higher cognitive ability. Or we have other topics, the neuroscience of multitasking, what motivates generosity, the neuroscience of creativity, what is the nature of forgiveness, why do soldiers commit war crimes, and should they be held responsible? So these are some interesting topics that some have large funding sources and some have smaller ones, but interesting topics, right? And then here we have implausible helps the world. The poster child of it is searching for the power stations of intelligent extraterrestrials. So they're trying to look for evidence of massive orbiting solar power stations constructed by advanced extraterrestrial civilizations. I got a $200,000 grant to study this question. Interesting. What are the origins of the universe? Now that's an interesting question. And then how might we detect multiple universes or multiverses? So these are the kinds of topics that are being, this is probably a year ago magazine, kind of current topics that you could say are more or less plausible, more or less applicable to individuals, and more or less justifiable depending on who you're talking to. So I think the plausibility, the meaningfulness of studies is really in the eye of the beholder, probably. Now, psychology in the public interest, I'm just going to let this lecture kind of go long, so I think one lecture is probably going to do it. Psychology in the public interest. APS, the Association for Psychological Science, has a vested interest in trying to communicate the meaningfulness of psychology to the average person. They actually have a journal called Psychology in the Public Interest. Actually, it's called Psychological Science in the Public Interest. And it publishes articles that have very applied research. APA also has a variety of journals that are directed at everyday people who maybe would be able to understand the purpose of psychology in the larger field when they can realize that our studies are applicable to them and are meaningful to them. So this was our defensiveness chapter. To wrap it up, hopefully these some of the stuff that we talked about in this chapter will help you when your friends find out that you're a psych major and give you any kind of guff over, it's all just obvious or common sense or who needs to do this research, things like that. Hopefully this gave you some tools to, have snappy comebacks. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure lecturing you this quarter, and hopefully you enjoyed it as well. Hopefully I'll see you someday soon.